This is a podcast which does not shy away from difficult and vulnerable topics, and we ask you to take care of yourselves when you listen. The content is of an adult nature, and we do swear at times.
Welcome to the Autistic Licence podcast. I'm Leo in London.
I'm Shauna, and I'm in Carrickfergus in Northern Ireland.
We invite you to listen in on our conversations as we experiment with unmasking in an autistic space. We talk about what it means to discover we're autistic as adults, especially with established careers as therapists. We want people to know that autistic therapists exist and to broaden the conversation about neurodiversity. You're so welcome to join us, whoever you are and wherever in the world you are. We hope you'll find something of interest and connection here.
I'm just going to ask you if you'd like to introduce yourself. Just say anything that you want to, just to get us started, and then we'll let the conversation take its own course from there.
Yeah. And like a lot of, not just autistic people, but, like one of those questions I'm always dread is like, tell us something interesting about yourself. So I can't think of anything. No. Honestly, the most interesting things about me is that I'm autistic and I'm a lesbian. Everything else is really quite boring. So that's kind of like that. I mean, I'm from Australia originally. I'm 38. My wife is English. We have 2 grown-up children, and that's sort of hence I live in London now.
You live in London.
And I was diagnosed like in 2021, so pretty late and pretty recently. It was a very slow process of self-identifying and given my age back in the a couple of decades back, people weren't talking about women having autism, so they really didn't. It was quite a slow journey of that, but there was a point where I began to understand that women and girls with autism present with anxiety. And I also didn't actually even understand that I had anxiety, but that's another story which we can get into or whatever. But that's what prompted me to think, maybe I should take these kind of musings a bit more seriously.
Okay.
And so eventually, and it was a long, long process, I had actually 2 diagnoses. One with Sarah Hendricks, which is like non-clinical. And then I followed up with the National Autistic Society, the Lorna Wing Centre. And I think the interesting thing maybe for this conversation is it was only then that I realised, and all the work I've done since, that I actually had no sense of self-identity until I got the diagnosis. I didn't have literally those words, like I didn't have a sense of myself. Okay. Once I had the diagnosis, I, for the first time, had a sense of myself that I was then able to develop in the same way that teenagers do that kind of thing, sort of thing. So that was like one thing that I think is interesting, and that's obviously a journey, to develop that. So that I can say other things about me, but that maybe.
But so if we'd have asked you before then, tell us a bit about yourself.
It would have been a lot of penny masking going on, right? Sorry, Leo, I talked over you. What did you say?
No. That's what I was saying.
I would have been very nervous coming into the conversation because I would have known, and I probably would have prepared something so that I would know what to say. I would have. With masking, if you can, you sort of prepare so you know who you're talking to, and therefore, what you can say that's going to fly. Yeah. The less opportunity there is to do that, the more nervous I would have gotten. So I would have given stock answers around the work that I do and standard sort of attributes by which people define themselves publicly is what I would have done. But
it's interesting as well that you said like what teenagers do, because I think that's quite common, isn't it, that we feel like we're going through, if we felt like we went through it then, we feel like we're going through a different type of adolescence whenever we incorporate in our autistic identity to
100%.
That.
Even to the point of, I think initially you kind of really lean into areas about oh, am I like this? Am I like this? And you may or may not be, but that's similar to what teenagers do, right? You know, they trial out different things and, Yeah. And
even in the autistic community, you're making me think, like, how much of that do we kind of do? You know, whenever you're a teenager and you kind of go, okay, I like indie music. That's what the thing was when I was a teenager. And, you know, and you were all in, and that was your thing. And then you gradually started to think, maybe I'm allowed to like something else and still like that, and still be allowed to be part of that gang. And it's sort of like, because all autistic people aren't the same, but in the beginning, you read it all like, oh, yes, that's me, that's me, that's me, that's me. And actually, it doesn't really work like that. It gets much, much, much more nuanced. And
yes, you know, I have lived with that irony of just being so hidden from the world that I was out as a lesbian from like that I came out, I realized I was a lesbian in my early 20s. And I wasn't sort of closeted for very long, but it was in the 80s and 90s when it was still a little bit tricky with what you say and things like that. And even though I've always been out at work, for example, it has to be quite selective about whether you would lead with that and things like that, right? And also, just because I was masking so heavily, you know, throughout my adult life, it never occurred to me I could speak from the heart. Like, it was always like, what do I have to bring out for this conversation?
And now you can speak from the heart. That's what it feels like.
That is so much. And that is that whole sense of having a sense of identity, being permission to kind of go, it's okay. Like, you can just say, this is me, and go from there. Obviously, sometimes that takes courage depending on the situation, but it makes it very different in terms of just walking into a room and, yeah.
Wonderful. Yes. Leo, I feel like I'm dominating a little bit. Have you got
I've only just started. You're all right. I've been thinking the thing about, you know, a very, very late teenagehood that really resonated with me, and that's very lovely. I can relate to that a lot. There was, having been diagnosed, having found that identity, what are the ingredients of that? Like, this is how I imagine somebody that I might come across not being autistic and asking me about it. They might say something like, you know, how are you autistic? What is it that's autistic about you? And then I would get stuck because I'd be put on the spot, and we're not very comfortable with that. But I'm doing the same to you. What does that mean?
Gosh, that is a great question, right? Means so many things. And what my head's doing
great
right
as
now,
in enormous.
No, but both, right? What my head's doing right now is like, there's all these things like rushing past, going, which thing will I grab and talk about, right? So that's probably one of the ways.
Yes. Yeah.
That's probably one of the ways. I mean, I think, not directly answering your question, part of what I'm trying to work out is my whole being defined as being autistic, and then here's all the characteristics. A part of who I am, and it means these particular things, plus as well on these other things. Yeah. So I think that's kind of a constant, and I'm not sure if there's even like a clear answer to that, just like a model how you think about it. Yeah. I mean, you know, to give a slightly more straightforward answer that a neurotypical person might expect, one of the things I presented in the diagnosis was I had no friends at primary school, and I also couldn't make friends at secondary school. And I've only realized this quite recently. I left primary school with a 4-year experience of just not having any friendships at all, which, you know, you're sort of 7 to 10. That's how old I was in Australia. And, you know, that obviously did a lot more damage than I kind of obviously realized at the time. And I carried that into secondary school, of that dread of, this is going to start again. I'm going to have to, you know, I had no idea how people go about making friendships. I was completely clueless. My father was a clergyman. And so they were always, so I also have religious baggage. You've mentioned that on the, we could just, yeah. I'm not religious, just to clarify that. Okay. Anyway, but therefore, you know, there's always sort of big social events to do with it. And he was the sort of person who expected his family to be present at these events. My mother had to do a lot of entertaining. And so, you know, I do think I'm an introvert in the sense of I don't find it you know, the spoons thing. I don't find it energizing. I find I've got a very limited amount of spoons for parties and that sort of thing. But I was very acclimatized to, constantly being in a social setting. Even the house, it's a rectory and people are coming and going and all this kind of thing, right? Also, there was this sort of a sense of me at home as, there's something wrong with Elisabeth. She can't make friends, right? And this is, in fairness, so it was kind of a thing, a sort of a thing. And I obviously was trying to compensate for that and find ways of socializing. And also I did it's not that I can't make friends, right? It's that I don't know how to go into a group setting and find my place. And there's sort of the normal things that kids do to establish themselves in a group, and the importance, actually, because the reality is, in the playground, it is important to establish yourself in a group, because otherwise it's really hard to find a way of fitting in, because that's how the playground works, right? And I just didn't know that. But I did make individual friends, and I sort of tried to overcompensate a bit in my later teens by going out as much as possible. But even then, I was definitely, trying very hard, if that makes sense. Yeah. I've actually carried that with me a long time. It's only just now that I'm so that's like an example. But on the flip side, as I try to work that out, and what does that mean? When I look back, part of what I didn't know was happening is when humans get into a group that's more than, 10 people or something, the first thing they do is form subgroups, right? I had no idea that was going on, right? And now when I'm in that situation, I don't like to do that. I'm very non-tribal, really like to understand what is going on with the entire group. And I don't like to associate myself with just some small subgroup at the exclusion of others. Really uncomfortable doing that. So I think there's something in there that clearly would at least traditionally be linked with autism on sort of the social side of things. But also, I think that non-tribalism is, I do lead quite a lot of different things in my life. And I think there's something there about leadership and that I see they're connected in some way. So, and on the podcast, I've heard you talk about ego as a really interesting concept. And I also have a really, really low amount. I don't know if the right
down. I always say.
No, that's what lives.
That's something I've observed with other autistic people. So I think that all plays into that as well. So that's one kind of avenue.
Yes, I'm hearing you say that you can have an overall picture and see how everybody connects to everybody else, and if you were to go in too much to one group, then you would lose something of the overall as well. You wouldn't be able to keep track of everything that was happening.
Keeping track, absolutely. Sorry, go on.
I'm noticing that, and it's such an irony, isn't it? Because sometimes people in their broad stereotypical comments about us say that we're detail orientated and we don't see the full picture, but I'm actually hearing you talk about seeing the full picture and being able to track and notice and observe all of that, which we can't do if we're in a subgroup. We actually have to be outside to some degree. And I think the tribalism as well that you were talking about, I think that we resist that because we actually are naturally really pretty inclusive. We don't understand hierarchies, and we don't understand why one wouldn't talk to that person, or what would be the consequences of doing that or not doing that. And we're curious. So, we don't like to be limited. There's all of these wonderful reasons why that are not seen by an outside observer that looks on and thinks that person doesn't fit in. It's really not that simple.
There's more going on. Exactly. When I'm in a large group of people, what I most want to do is just sit and observe. I really like to do that. But of course, sometimes that's not socially acceptable. That seems odd in some settings. There was something else I was getting. As well as those things that you listed, Shauna, there's a sense of fairness. That idea that I might be focusing on one group and not giving my attention to another group. I feel I feel bad doing that, right? Even though it may not even be my place to. But on your point about high level and detail, one of the things, so something else about me, which I do, again, well, it's you might classify it as autistic, but is I really enjoy navigating between detail and high level. I'm doing it constantly. And so, for example, if I continue that social thing, if let's say it's a group that I'm connected with on a regular basis, then when I do have conversations, I'd like to have a one-to-one conversation, really understand each individual, what makes them tick and all sorts of things like that. because I think the most interesting stories, information, all of that is when you know the overall framework and the overall picture, but you also know the depth and the detail that goes with that. And so I'm, very aware of being able to process information like that. So we talk about social skills, but actually I'm translating that into information about a social setting. Yeah.
It's very clever.
I mean, I noticed what could be a real vicious circle in that situation as well in an early life. You talked about not having an identity. I mean, until like really recently, but you're talking about it being pre-diagnosis, if you like. But if you don't have an identity, how do you find your people in a group? How do you find your place? Because, I can go and say, hey, I'm Leo, I play the drums, and that might be my thing at school. You need some of those hooks, but it works the other way around as well. If you don't have a place, how can you develop an identity? So that feels impossible.
It was very hard. The other thing I'll observe, and this is obviously a massive generalization, but we have a son and a daughter. We have a son and a daughter, and definitely, there's a few things to say around this actually, but I'm a little bit loath to generalize about boys and girls and men and women and all that kind of thing. But I do think there's whether through social norms, probably more that, boys are more able to go, oh, you play the drums, I play the drums, we're friends. That's how I made friends at school. Funnily enough, I was at an all-girls school, but I was musical. And so the first friendships I ended up in were with other musical girls. And so we did things musically together. And so, whereas I think with girls, and again, I think this is as much as anything social norms as opposed to anything else, but there is this kind of really complex emotional situation going on, which I'm still like, I first of all have to go, I'm feeling something. It's good or it's bad. I go from there, it's just kind of figure it out. I wouldn't ever navigate, even today, I wouldn't ever navigate friendships based on some of the extraordinary complex, best friend rules that seem to exist in women's circles. And I have often, I don't get involved often in the sort of women's groups and things because I find neurotypical women can be really intimidating to me. I just find it really scary.
Yeah. I don't think I know the rules, Elisabeth. I don't even think that I could comment on what on earth those rules are. And I'm sort of thinking for me, that was a big pull into Christianity, into religion in my teens, because that gave me the identity that I could just put on, and that gave me the structures and the belongingness of a sort for a time. Because that was your identity, and because everybody saw that as your primary identity, and you were taught that was your primary identity, nothing else mattered. And I can see how, looking back, it would have always been something there was always going to be something that I got into in that way that would tell me who I was. And I think that there is a kind of a hesitation now whenever I stand back from the autistic community a little bit, and I wonder, is that all of my identity? To go back to that thing you were kind of talking about a wee while ago, is that my identity, or is it just that it is something that resonated strongly, for me 6-7 years ago? And it's not that it doesn't resonate strongly now, but I was and I am careful, about putting everything into that, because I know my tendency to try and find something that's going to explain, and if we've got the framework, then we can put ourselves into it. And was that still, there probably is still after all this time, still a sense of me, well, am I going to come out the other side? Is it going to be another thing that I'm going to have found and then go out and go, no, that was just something else that I took a deep dive into? I don't know, probably not that extreme, but I just know the tendency is there, and the seeking for something, and just not knowing what is actually autism really. I know people try and explain it in so many different ways, but actually what really is it? And how in 10 years, will it feel like it's the most interesting thing about me, or will it just be nothing? It'll just be nothing, you know, it'll be something else, you know. I don't know. I don't know the answer to.
Yeah. And I also think maybe it might be that part of who you are is that seeking and trying things on. That's probably a key part of who you are.
Yes, thank you. Lovely.
Yes. I think I still am the why, the why person that's always, and why and what if and what's next.
And also, you know, it's important to you to experience something to really understand it.
Yeah.
Things like that. And you might get bored with it, or you might find something that you are now more interested to try and what have you. But that's like maybe part of who you are.
There's a difference, isn't there? Because that can be labelled as a very superficial way of navigating your way through life, you know, just kind of hopping onto interesting things and finding out about them and then there. But that's not what I experience, and I don't think that's what, Shauna, you're experiencing either. I don't think this is all real. And I like the way, Elisabeth, that you kind of framed that, is that actually that's a big chunk of your identity, as somebody who seeks out and explores different areas, different bits of identity.
Yeah.
That's real. That's real.
Is that autism, or is
you know,
it's autism for me because I'm autistic, but it's somebody who isn't autistic may well also do that, and it might also be real. I think there is something that you said, Shauna, which I definitely believe as well. You know, in 10 years' time, is that going to be the most interesting thing about you? Is it even going to be a thing? And I'm pretty convinced that it won't be. Maybe not 10 years, but certainly 10, 20, 30. You know, this is where we are now. We always think we're at the pinnacle or at the final, most enlightened stage of any process, and of course we're not. You know, and I often think of, you know, we don't say Asperger's anymore, and it's not in the DSM anymore, and we, you know, because for good reasons. But the people that, you know, I know and work with sometimes, that was their diagnosis just a few years ago. It wasn't very long.
My diagnosis.
Oh, okay. Yes, of course. Yeah. Right. And that for them was the label that set them free. And, you know, autism is the label that set me free. So I'm very, very attached to it. So I'm kind of very respectful, I think, of those people who are Aspergic. That's their label. I don't like it, and I may well say why I don't. You know, anyway, what I'm saying is, I think the same thing will happen to me. I am very attached to my autistic and ADHD identities, or my neurodivergent identity, and it's probably going to go away if we take the trajectory of how we look at how we work and how our brains work. It'll probably just be, eventually that thing of, oh, we're all a little bit autistic might actually be valid at some point. I mean, again, that turns my stomach right now because it's not true. But all I'm saying is people will probably find aspects of my identity difficult in the future because we'll have moved on with how those labels and those models are viewed and how they work and how they're applied.
Okay, I understand what you mean.
But I'm always going to be very attached to it because that was the huge thing that gave me all of my identity. It's not that it's all autistic. I just mean that made everything make sense to me at that moment in time.
And me, and I think a lot of people say that. I think there's a lot of interesting things in this, right? One is about labels and the medical models that are used, the fact that they're medical models, there's a hell of a lot there to unpack. And I also think there's for me, the models are kind of like the labels rather are kind of like a glue, right? That sits between me and who I really am, which is for me to say and for me to decide what words I use. And the clinical community where we're talking about the medical labels like autistic, ADHD, etc., which to your point, change over time, right? And there's a usefulness to those labels for certain things. And then there's a point where I kind of go, well, I've got what I need from that label, and these are the words I want to use to explain who I am. And I don't want to be I don't need to be defined by that ever-changing sort of medical model landscape. I respect it, and I respect the fact that some people will have a greater need to use those labels for different things and, all of that. So I'm not dismissing it. But, it's a glue for me. It's not something, the label itself doesn't define me. It's a useful tool. It gives me a useful tool. So then when we say that in 10 years' time we'll have moved on, Another thing for me is what I take from my experience as a lesbian, as an LGBTQ plus person, both individually and how our experience in the world, and bring across to the autistic community or the neurodivergent community. And one of those things is exactly all these pieces around that attach to one of them is around disclosure, actually, and coming out and what that journey's like, and how you can do that in healthy ways and that sort of thing. So that was helpful. Also, the movements, right? So if you look at the LGBTQ plus movement, at least in the Western world, right, US, UK, Australia, parts of Europe and so on, I would say it's kind of 30, 40 years ahead of where the particularly autistic community movement is, in terms of self-advocacy, in terms of influencing the popular narrative, breaking down stigma, having, positive stereotypes, but also having a range of it takes a time to build that. It takes decades to build that. And you need to. So I think we're maturing towards that. But if you look at the other reason I say that is if you look at the LGBTQ, it's still not the case that people are going, it's still a difference. So it might be like, you might say, the percentages of young people who identify that way is going up. There's all sorts of markers which indicate it's becoming less controversial in some geographies, not in all geographies. But the piece that doesn't change is we're different. And I don't think that will change for neurodivergent people. The fact that the medical models might still be figuring out what's going on. My question there is this really a medical condition? Because for me, it's a social and educational piece, right? And I don't know that the medical models serve us particularly, the medical community serves us particularly well. But I think whatever it is, it'll always be a difference.
That's
and I think I think there's a lot to unpack there. I'm going to stop. So now I've been monologuing. Sorry.
That's a wonderful.
There's more I could go to there. There's more I could go to there, but I'll pause. Yeah.
That's a wonderful distinction. Thank you so much, because I am very, I get a lot of joy from, thinking about neuroqueer as a whole.
Oh, I love that label.
Umbrella. Yes.
Absolutely identifies queer.
Yes. And of course, the other thing, you were saying about being, 30 years ahead in terms of the list that you gave. And also there is that move away from the medical model, because we don't have to go back very far to find homosexuality is a mental disorder in the DSM.
The joke I like to make is, I didn't have to go and see a psychiatrist to get diagnosed as a lesbian.
Yes, exactly.
Now, I think one has to be, I'm very careful who I say that to in relation to autism.
Yes, but you sometimes need the labels to get through the red tape to get the services, because that's what I've had to do with
that's how the system works today.
How the system works, and then you're still up against, people thinking it's a medical thing and not wanting to, so much around it that just it's gate kept and commodified. I was thinking there as well about, you said 34 years, and it just made me think, right,
40 years, around about that.
I know, but I'm autistic, so I take exactly 34 years off. So I'm like, okay, 1991.
Very precise.
Yes. How many gay people did I know in 1991? What was the scene like? Because that concretizes it for me. That makes me go, well, what was happening? So at that stage, I was actually the same age as my daughter then. So I was 15, coming 16, and that's really easy for me to go, well, what was it like then? Was anybody out? Was anybody out? No, I knew people came out in sixth form. So a couple of years later, there was the first people starting to talk and do that. But they were very, very, very brave. It was not commonplace and dramatically different to how it is nowadays in my daughter's peer group, for example. So it's really, it's such a good flashback to do that and to think, okay, if it is around about that, then yes, we probably are still around there. If we didn't have the internet, now the internet has changed things because we can all connect with each other in a way that we couldn't in the 90s. But that aside, You know, sometimes even the internet makes us feel like we're further on than we really are. But actually in you know, our everyday lives, we're still similar to how it was for the LGBTQ plus community in the early 90s. You know, I still have conversations. I had a conversation with somebody yesterday who spoke about somebody as being autistic and doesn't know that I am autistic. And it was this total stereotype that they were having of this person. And this person is a professional, kind, everyday person, you know, and that's everywhere. There was nothing unusual about them. That's the norm, is that most people don't know what the neurodiversity movement is or what this full spectrum of being autistic looks like. And that's really similar to how it was in 1991.
And that reinforces for me something that you were saying, Elisabeth, that really has, I've just been turning it round in my head. Yes, I almost want to take back everything I said about the evolution of neurodiversity and labelling, because it is superficially true that will happen. But your point is that we are still different is the absolute key. And I don't want to let go of that, actually. And it might be that those differences are less impactful if the world does become more accommodating, and, you know, then it may not matter so much. You know, left-handed people would have been pariahs in certain points in history, etc., and it doesn't matter now. But it is still a difference, and that's the valuable part for me. I don't want to let go. It's actually not the label. That's actually quite huge for me. I really hadn't thought about it deeply enough to arrange it in my head like that.
But do we define ourselves by our difference, though? I think that's what maybe I'm thinking. Will it feel so important to...
I think it depends on... So, by the way, I wanted to say, I do exactly the same thing. When I'm reading something and I see a date, the first thing I do is contextualize it with how does that relate to me in my life or my ancestors or something, because I can then start to make sense of what I'm reading. I just wanted to...
Me too, and that was the very first thing that was spotted as possibly autistic about me about 35 years ago by a friend who is now an autism specialist in psychology. But it was exactly that. I map dates out, and I can always tell people, no, I know it was then because it was 3 weeks after the blah, 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 and I know that because. I just thought that was normal. Anyway, sidebar ended.
Exactly. Like, where did we...
Sorry.
No, it was me.
It's terrible.
What were you going to say, Elizabeth?
The point about being different. I think, and again, I'm only just talking from my experience here. So it's not like, you know...
That's all we
have to go
on. I think we don't have to caveat that anymore. We are all doing that as individuals. That's fine.
But, you know, one of the things, as you're growing up, you're presented with frames of references about that you may or may not identify with, that may or may not resonate with you. And so if you are a straight, white, neurotypical person, and then there's a gender element here, but you know, the frames of references that you get from the world generally are going to resonate, and you'll figure out a sense of identity from that. I know, again, huge generalization. But if the straight reference isn't resonating with you, frame of reference isn't resonating, if the neurotypical all those, then they come from school, they come from television, they come from everything that you're presented with, and even maybe in the home, depending on what your parents are like and what your brothers and sisters are like and all that kind of thing. And so I think one of the big factors is, like, for example, I didn't know I was a lesbian until in my early 20s, because I didn't even really understand it was a thing, you know? Now, nowadays, to your point, Shauna, like, probably most kids at high school in the UK and Northern Ireland, you know, will probably have had some sort of pride-related conversation at some point. There's a lot of people doing that work. There's a lot more on television and all of that. So people at least know it's a thing, right? They may or may not feel comfortable saying, hang on, I think that's who I am. But I guess, and then definitely with the neurotypical stuff, I mean, we're here like 3 professional adults trying to say, what does it mean to be autistic? And like, we'll probably only scratch the surface on this conversation. So, you know, and you mentioned the stigmas and the depth of misunderstanding that's still out there, and I think that will be there for a while. So I think when you grow up and you feel different, you feel othered, and particularly when you don't know what that is because you don't have a frame of reference that says, oh, it's because I'm this, which I think will be the case for neurodivergent people. Like maybe dyslexia is a little easier because there's a lot of very kind of clear cut, or I don't know if clear cut's the right word, but so I guess you grow up with that and you start, it's not, I agree with you, it's not so much about defining yourself as being different, it's more about your lived experience is one of difference that you've had to make sense of. And that may or may not have been a traumatic experience for you, right? And I'll just say one other thing. Sorry, you have to stop me if I'm monologuing too much. That, I define privilege as the ability to just be yourself without asking permission.
Indeed.
And if you've grown up with that, there's certain categories of, people who just can take that for granted through their whole lives. They've not had this experience of difference. And when you see those people in their adult lives suddenly come up against a situation where they can't just take for granted being themselves. It really throws them. And so I think it's those themes as opposed to a definitional thing. Those are the themes that where I end up coming back to, there's something about difference that will always be there, and it's for us to own, and it's for us to, And
if it has always been the case that you've had to, and maybe it doesn't feel like a definition, but you've had to engage with the world from a place of difference, then you will have, it will feel like more of an identity in the sense of the weight of it on you. And will feel, you're likely to have trauma attached to it, because if you're constantly othered and marginalised, which often brings with it exploitation and oppression, then there's going to be that flavour to even being different. And I think that then in itself that can then sometimes be, and I'm kind of asking myself, what is it that feels like it could chain me if I don't work in a particular way with it. And I think it's that if we over-identify with that, and that it is over-identifying with being othered rather than just with myself as a member of a small community. It's like as a child. So if as a child we have those significant others who mirror us and reflect us and see us and bring us out, we only need one or two of them and we will emerge with a sense of self and a sense of okayness, a sense of love. If there's nobody like that, then we won't, then we'll struggle. And something around where you can be different, you can be in the minority, but as long as there's some people with you, that's okay. That's an okay thing. If there's nobody with you, then it'll be a traumatic thing. And it's a thin line then in terms of
I agree.
Your identity.
It's a thin line. I had nobody like that, so yes. When
did you leave Australia?
1989. So I was 22. I was 23, or about. No, I had my 23rd birthday in Asia. A month later, I was traveling in Asia.
You were traveling
with my now wife and her sister, and who I'd met in Australia, and. So I'd finished university and I came over here, and most of my adult life has been here.
Okay, yes, your adult life's been here. And I'm being curious now. I want to know what it is that you do for work.
Yes, I was going. Oh
gosh, right. Okay.
I was going to just say I want to be really superficially curious now.
That's fine. This is the boring bit, actually. This is the boring bit. So I qualified as an accountant on arriving. I had a degree in a similar area, but and I now I've worked in investment banking for like 30 years or something.
Okay, yeah.
And I, surprise, am very focused on data. And sort of like something, so I use the information processing piece I talked about, the big picture, quite a lot in work, in terms of I can move across to lots of different domains and learn them very quickly, but I can also, I'm very instinctive about designing information systems and things like that. So that's what I now do. And what I recently did was moved into, so I worked for one of the big American banks, and obviously we're a huge player in the capital markets. And I got very interested to understand, well, what are we doing about climate change? What are we doing about the emissions that our financing causes? And happily, we're taking that very seriously. And so I've managed to get myself into that space because there's a lot of alignment with my values there, you know, but a lot of work to do around the data that supports that. So that's what I do. Yeah. But I also do a lot of work on, so I've always, you know, gotten very involved on running pride groups, and I now run, this is extracurricular, obviously, a sort of a group which looks at the intersection, which kind of tries to build community around the intersection between, with neurodivergent people generally, and also leveraging the intersection between pride and neurodivergence, because it's not small, and sort of saying, look, you know, what can I bring forward from my pride experience into the neurodivergent community building experience and all of that. So I also do that, but that's you know, voluntary sort of thing.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating.
I was going to ask if you're out at work, and then I realised that I need to define what kind of out.
I know, and I've had to go through the whole, like, so, you know, I was terrified. I couldn't even come out to my parents. My wife had to do that for me. But this is about being a lesbian. I mean, that bit of coming out. But then when she was pregnant with our first daughter, with our first child, so we didn't know what we were having. But I just thought, well, I'm not going to have a family at home and not talk about like that. It's just, I'm not doing that, you know. So that meant that I had to come. So I've always been out at work. But what happens is you come out, as I'm sure you know, to, you know, a small group of people, and then it's like, do I come out to all the teams I'm working with? And so I've gradually come out more and more publicly over the decades in a work context. And then as there's been these increasing opportunities to take a leadership role in terms of community leadership, you know, network leadership, that sort of thing. Partly because still now it's not as bad as it was, but for the first 20 years of my career, I was the only out lesbian in place, right? And certainly the only senior, you know, not that senior, you know. So you get tapped up to lead things and stuff, or just, you know, but it turns out that is a really, doing advocacy work and doing work with the community, that is a really fantastic way to deal with shame and like to build resilience and own your narrative and all of those really positive things. And so I've been really intentional about, and so I'm also out as an autistic person, but and I also, you know, started small and then went bigger, but that's been much faster because I've had the experience of doing, and I knew how to build allies around me, and you know, all those kinds of things that took me 20 years to figure out, I was able to do much more quickly. And the organisation is very positive on, you know, they support us doing community work around neurodivergency and that sort of thing. So
you have been a real pioneer, Elisabeth. You really have. You really, really have. And I can see how you've got this unique position as well within the queer community, with the LGBTQ plus community. You know, you've got a voice within that the community there to talk about neurodivergence, because sometimes I feel like there's still a bit of a reluctance, even though we know there's so much crossover between you know, the autistic, the neurodivergent community and the queer community. There seems to be a reluctance from within the queer community to speak about it. Well, what I find is that in some of my circles, in therapy circles, is that people are much more out about their queerness, and they maybe specialise in queerness and working with queer people, and all the advertising is around the work that they do with LGBTQ plus people, but it's just not about neurodivergence yet.
That goes along with what Elisabeth was saying about that kind of 30-40 year trailing timeline between queer communities and neurodivergence. It is still stigmatized, and it is specifically stigmatized in our profession because it is a mental health condition. And should we be therapists if we are ill like that.
So is that
does
really
exist.
still a...
I've been told by senior people, I think I've said this before, that they don't think I'd have been accepted onto my training if I'd have been diagnosed and out as autistic 10 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, I have a friend, yes, so I think there is still a lot of stigma. I absolutely think that's one of the things at the root of that. And that might hold people back even from their own self-realizations, because you can process the things probably, and then if they do know, it might hold them back on, various stages of that.
Professional, whether they're going to come out professionally. Yes,
it is. To your point, it is right, and I think that's why people are scared. And
I wonder if, to some degree, whenever you're kind of out and you're in the circles maybe that we're in, we sometimes still get a shock whenever we realise that, because we have kind of maybe got, we've resourced ourselves enough, and we've got enough people around us, and we read the stuff, and we feel buoyed up in some ways by that. And it's only when we get these shock situations sometimes when we realise the world is really not very far on, and you kind of get reminded of it. And I also, I wondered myself if, 25 years ago, I probably wouldn't have, if I had been diagnosed autistic, I probably wouldn't have got on my course, because I was already young, and they would have always said, well, you definitely haven't got a clue if you're autistic. But also, if I had been at different other points in my career, I was so lucky that I was already out in private practice, and I had a successful, people were referring to me, people had known me for a long time, and there wasn't such a risk. Whereas, coming out at different times in your career, in different spaces, is more of a risk, and people will not have anything else to go on. Then they'll just go on the label, as opposed to, but this is still the same person as I've known for 20 years. So, they're probably still able to do their job. They haven't suddenly stopped being able to do their job. But if you're at a different stage in your career, then you might feel like you've got much more to prove.
Yeah, I think all that's very, very true. And if you think about all these observations we're making, and then and all the variations on them, and the multiple other avenues we could go down on this topic.
Yeah.
That's why, it's because that is multiplied by the thousands of therapists who are queer, and, their journeys to, it's, and that's why it's not like, it's no straight path or formulaic way of but I like the mirror with the gay community, because not because it's necessarily going to be the exact same process, but because it is a very kind of human community thing that has to happen. And it's sort of, you reach these tipping points where suddenly you look back and you think, wow, that's really different from what it was 10 years ago, and things like that. So I think that's where I see hope as well, right?
And we do that mirroring to each other that we didn't have back in the day. And I think that's what you're talking about with the community. We reflect back, yes, I see you, yes, I get it. And then that does make us more robust and more insulated to go out in the world again. But it is a ripple effect through the community. It can't be done in any other way.
And do you think that sometimes might it be the case, and I don't know this because I don't know the therapist community, but do you think that sometimes some of those therapists have already had to be courageous and work hard to be out as a queer therapist, and they're like, enough, right? Do you think there's some of that going on?
Yeah, when you were just saying that there, I thought, that's probably it. Like, why?
Some of it, I think there's probably multiple.
But that would be there too. Like, why? Yeah.
And if you're autistic and you've got this core value of justice and fairness and equality, then you're constantly, and I hear this all the time, in this dilemma of wanting to, and this is, obviously one of the reasons for being in therapy is to prioritize and develop self-care. But also to feel the obligation against that to be out and to educate and to represent, and to not do that really rankles, because it really comes up against, if I keep quiet about this for very good reasons of self-care, I've already come out as queer, and that was this much trauma, and I've had it, that's enough for me. Somebody else can do that bit. But it is a real fight for so many people.
Yeah.
Because of that lag behind that you've beautifully.
I have the same sentiment. I think that representation and being a voice and all of that stuff is so important, not just for us as individuals, but for the whole community. And so I have to be very careful not to judge, because, you know, and this is obviously a big thing in the queer world, because there was that whole period in the early 90s when celebrities and politicians were being outed, and there was some radical action around that. And I don't agree with that. I think that's wrong. I think people do have to be allowed to have their, you know, to go on their journey and what have you. But we also know that some of those people that were outed were doing very homophobic things and hurting the community. So it's like, as you say, it is. Yes. I do personally, for me, it's important to be that way that you're describing. And we also have those examples, you know, very senior people in the industry I work in. That's why there's very few senior out people, because they've got lived their careers without being out, and then they've got a huge decision to make. Do I now suddenly, as the generation, you know, that will slowly reduce, at least in, you know, some settings. And there's 80 countries in the world where it's still illegal or death penalty, so it's still, you know.
And we are seeing a massive rollback on diversity and inclusion now, aren't we? And there was one today. Was it one of the banks actually today? I read scrapping their D&I.
So Deloitte partners who work in the US,
that was it.
US government. Yeah, I read that one today as well. They're dropping the pronouns from their communications with US government officials. Yeah.
What I would going back to I know, because
I know, it's just like, where do you go with this?
It's very deeply troubling.
Yes, it is.
But going back to the values thing, see, this is I know I'm trotting out something I've said a number of times, and it's fairly superficial, but, you know, the core values that I more and more identify as autistic values, which you know are, of course, they're all good things. They're all things that everybody that you ask would say, yes, that is why you should be, and that's how you should live. I think the autistic part of that is the lack of choice, or the massive reduction in choice as to whether we uphold those values or not, regardless of personal cost, which is what you were just talking about.
Okay, yes, and we take it literally as well. We take it literally,
but you know, it goes back to I always say, you know, every high-profile whistleblower that's ever in the news, they're always autistic, and it's because it's very difficult to make that value judgment about how much this is going to cost me to speak out.
Yeah.
And far more often it gets weighted towards the upholding the value. And there's just, I do believe that it's an autistic thing that we have far less choice as to whether we can make those judgments. Okay, this is going to mean 10 years in prison. It's just not going to be worth it. It's harder. Not impossible, but it's harder.
I agree. Just going on my own experience, I would agree with that. Yeah.
And yet, in some way, we often need support not to do that and to take care of ourselves.
That's the dilemma
you know, and that again is the ego thing, isn't it? Like we don't take care of ourselves. We will just put ourselves on the line
because it's the right thing.
Because it's the right thing to do. But it's like, even going back to that small example that I gave of having a conversation yesterday, and someone made a really outdated view of an autistic person, and I chose not to use my energy to intervene and teach. It was an opportunity. I didn't do it. And I do that sometimes, and I don't do that on other days.
And it's really good.
I don't feel bad. Don't feel bad about that anymore. But that is due to some kind of self-compassion process that has gone on that I didn't used to have. And I don't think it's necessarily then a core autistic thing. It's also autistic, and it's related to a trauma that then makes us overcompensate by doing for other people certain things and going over and above, and also just this literal kind of, that's the right thing, so I will do it. And that's where, so another thing that was going in my mind was a parallel with like religious stuff and like, you know, taking that all literally. You must do that. If you really are this thing, then you must always, you know, stand up for this thing and whatever that is, and unattaching from the trauma of that, both in a religious sense and in an autistic sense of everything's life or death. Nobody stood up for me, so I must stand up for everyone else. And
but it's not just, Shauna, I would say that it's not just that you have learned self-compassion. I am guessing that you have learned it from the experience of it costing you huge amounts to stand up to those values. You've learned that sometimes you shouldn't do it. That's
the case for me. Oh, but yeah.
Because there's always arguments that you know, there's always voices that say, yeah, but you still should have done it anyway.
Yeah, yes. But the fact is, I bet that you have a number of times that's cost you so much that there's a lived experience of why it's easier now to sometimes step away and say no, because you've experienced the cost.
Possibly, Leo, but I think that the compassion coming in means that I don't compulsively do it anyway. Because I think no matter how much I learned, I would still compulsively do the thing because I thought it was right. I don't think that the justice is at the top anymore for me, but I can still be honest.
I suppose I'm just suggesting that the journey to that was through having paid some costs for standing up to you don't think so? Okay, maybe it's just...
I'm not going to agree until I know.
Turn that round and say, that's my experience.
Yeah. But it is interesting, that word justice, isn't it? Because that's definitely something I've always had a kind of burning sense of things being just or unjust, and as a big driver, right? The journey that led me to look at what my company's activity was around, you know, the emissions, our indirect emissions, was actually reading this book here. It's one of those things that I picked up in an airport, Smith's.
Just read it out so that our listeners.
I'm sorry. It's a black, slightly oversized paperback,
and it's called.
Title is Very Bad People. Yeah. And I thought, well, this is either going to be terrible or really good. And it's by Patrick Alley, who is one of the founding members of Human Rights Watch. I have a feeling I've got the name of the charity wrong. I'll double check it and I'll confirm, right? But anyway, it's the first 10 years of their formation, starting with somewhere in the first half of the 1980s, I think, pre-digital phones, digital cameras rather, pre-internet, pre-mobile phones, you know, all of that. And they were one of the first, or they say they were one of the first sort of NGOs or charities working at the intersection between human rights and environment.
Yes.
And reading the stories of their first 10 years. So they uncovered things like conflict timber, blood diamonds, all of that kind of thing. And they would publish in-depth reports and work with intergovernmental bodies to introduce, you know, new standards, and that, you know, really powerful organization. And that's what helped me to understand when people talk about climate justice, there is this really important overlap between human rights and the environment and the way we've degraded the environment and everything that means. You know, the groups that usually bear the biggest cost of that are groups who are also suffering with human rights. And so that value that I have around that sense of, and I can't get away from it, right? Like that sense of fairness and justice, and why some humans why it should be just so extremely unjust and all of that. Yeah, it's a really innate value, and I can't get away from it. And to be able to work even in some small way connected with that is really, really motivating for me.
Yes.
Global Witness.
Thank you. That's who that.
I looked it up.
I knew it wasn't. I knew I had the name wrong. Global Witness. Yeah. Really. Yeah. Phenomenal organisation. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you. Elizabeth, is there anything else? I'm just looking at the time.
Yes, I don't know what. Yeah.
We need a part two.
We did this with the other people as well, and we do this together. But we'll see if we can. Is there anything else that you were hoping that we might chat about? That just before we wrap it up.
So I a couple of things. One is we've started already, but continuing that dialogue around community. And I know that's something one of the podcasts I listen to, I know you're thinking about how can we be intentional around that. So I think that is a really, really interesting topic. So that would be one.
Okay.
And then the other, which is probably a much smaller topic, is I'm I've never been to Ortscape. I don't know if either of you have.
Yeah.
I went last year.
What's it
I
like?
went the year before, and the weekend just passed was online Ortscape.
I think I saw it. I'm toying with the idea of going, but yeah. But I think that's not. I don't know if that's a quick. Do you go? Do both of you go? Or?
We've both been. So.
We've both been. I went 2 years ago, and Leo went last year. And there is actually an episode that we recorded on Leo's experience. So you might be able to hear that one.
It was for me.
Yes.
Absolutely magical to be in an environment.
Yes.
Where you are absolutely the mainstream.
Yeah.
And there aren't accommodations. It's just there. It's all there. Everything is okay.
Yeah.
It's just one of the most enriching and moving experiences I've had, and it's heartbreaking too, because you then have to leave after 4 days. My experience was absolutely incredible, and
so I think I might try and I'll definitely listen to the episode, and then I'll have I gone about this the right way? Like, should I be asking you
what's the right way?
I don't know, like what it feels
like a very rich episode to me. It really does.
There's no right way, Elizabeth. Honestly, we're like this ourselves whenever we record. Every single time we come off, I say there's nothing in that, and always. So it's been wonderful. Thank you so much for being with us.
And you. Well, thank you for having me.
Being with you.
Yeah. And likewise. Yeah. I'd love to talk again. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Take care.
Goodbye.
And you. Bye.
Thank you for listening to the Autistic License podcast. You can connect with us via Instagram, Facebook, YouTube at autisticlicense.com or by email at autisticlicense@gmail.com. We spell license LICENCE. We also have a Facebook community. You can search for Autistic License Shauna and Leo. Shauna spelled SIANA, or you can click on the link in the show notes.